Imagine being born inside a metal corridor, surrounded by recycled air, artificial light, and walls that stretch in every direction but never open to a sky. You will live your entire life here. You will die here, not because you chose to, but because your great-great-grandparents made that choice for you centuries before you existed. You will never feel wind. You will never see a horizon. The destination your ancestors launched toward is still generations away, and the world they left behind has forgotten your name. This is not science fiction. This is the logical consequence of humanity's most celebrated answer to interstellar distance, the generation ship. And the reality of what it would actually demand from the people trapped inside it is far worse than anyone wants to admit. If you find this kind of deep science storytelling valuable, consider liking and subscribing. We do not chase trends here. We chase the questions that actually matter. Are you comfortable? Let's begin. The nearest star to our Sun is called Proxima Centauri. It sits in the Alpha Centauri system, a triple-star arrangement in the southern constellation Centaurus. It is the closest star beyond our own, the very nearest one, and it is 4.2 light-years away. That number sounds manageable until you convert it into something a human mind can actually hold. A light-year is the distance that light itself, the fastest thing permitted by the laws of physics, covers in one full year of continuous travel. Light moves at roughly 186,000 miles per second. Not per hour, per second. In 1 year at that speed, it crosses approximately 5.88 trillion miles. Multiply that by 4.2, and you arrive at the distance to Proxima Centauri, roughly 25 trillion miles. 25 trillion miles to the nearest star. Not the nearest interesting star, not the nearest star with a confirmed habitable planet, the nearest star, period. Now consider how fast humanity's fastest spacecraft has ever traveled. The Parker Solar Probe, launched by NASA in 2018, reached speeds of approximately 430,000 miles per hour during its closest approaches to the Sun. That is the fastest any human-made object has ever moved. At that speed, reaching Proxima Centauri would take roughly 6,700 years. 6,700 years. For context, that is longer than the entirety of recorded human civilization. The oldest known writing system, Sumerian cuneiform, dates to approximately 3,400 BCE. If a spacecraft had launched at Parker Solar Probe speeds the day the first human pressed a stylus into wet clay in ancient Mesopotamia, that spacecraft would still not have arrived at Proxima Centauri today. It would still have roughly 1,200 years of travel remaining, and that is the closest star. The galaxy contains somewhere between 100 billion and 400 billion others. Most of them are incomprehensibly farther away. The center of the Milky Way is roughly 26,000 light-years from Earth. The nearest large galaxy, Andromeda, is 2.5 million light-years distant. The observable universe stretches roughly 46 billion light-years in every direction. The distances involved in interstellar travel are not merely large. They are hostile to every assumption humans carry about journeys, exploration, and arrival. On Earth, every expedition in history, no matter how dangerous or remote, shared one characteristic. The travelers could, in principle, turn around. They could change their minds. They could fail and still drift home on a current or walk back along a trail or radio for rescue. The ocean is wide, but the other shore exists within a single lifetime. Interstellar space offers no such mercy. The other shore is so far away that the traveler who departs will not live to see it. Neither will their children. In many realistic scenarios, neither will their grandchildren. This is the wall. Not a wall of engineering, not a wall of funding or political will, a wall of time. Human trafficking across interstellar distances is fundamentally a problem of lifespan versus distance. And no propulsion system that obeys known physics eliminates it entirely. Scientists and engineers have proposed many ways to shorten the crossing. Nuclear pulse propulsion, first explored during Project Orion in the late 1950s and early 1960s, riding the shockwaves to high velocity. Theoretical designs suggested speeds of 3 to 5% the speed of light might be achievable, reducing a trip to Proxima Centauri to perhaps 80 to 140 years. Fusion propulsion. The concept behind the British Interplanetary Society's Project Daedalus in the 1970s proposed using deuterium and helium-3 reactions to accelerate an uncrewed probe to roughly 12% light speed, reaching Barnard's star in about 50 years. More recent concepts, like breakthrough starshot, envision using ground-based laser arrays to accelerate tiny, gram-scale light sails to 20% the speed of light, reaching Proxima Centauri in approximately 20 years. But there is a critical detail embedded in all of these faster proposals. Nearly every one that achieves a reasonable travel time does so by making the payload extremely small or by eliminating human passengers entirely. Breakthrough Starshot's light sail would weigh roughly 1 gram. Project Daedalus was designed as a robotic flyby probe. The moment you add the mass of a crewed habitat, with air, water, food, shielding, living space, and the bodies of the people themselves, the energy requirements climb by orders of magnitude. The fuel mass alone becomes a problem that devours every engineering advantage. You need fuel to accelerate the fuel that will decelerate the ship at the other end. The math is punishing. For a crewed vessel carrying hundreds or thousands of people, even optimistic fusion propulsion concepts struggle to push beyond 1 to 5% light speed without requiring fuel masses that exceed the mass of the ship itself by absurd ratios. This is where the generation ship enters the picture, and it enters not as a radical idea, but as a quiet concession, a surrender to arithmetic. If you cannot make the journey fast enough for one crew to survive it, you design a vessel large enough for a population to live, reproduce, and sustain itself across the entire crossing. The people who board the ship at departure will not arrive. Their children will not arrive, but their descendants, many generations later, will. The ship becomes a world, not a vehicle that carries passengers to a destination, but an enclosed civilization that drifts through the void while human lives cycle within it, like seasons inside a greenhouse. The concept is not new. The American rocket pioneer Robert Goddard, best known for launching the first liquid-fueled rocket in 1926, wrote privately about the idea of an interstellar ark as early as 1918. He imagined a vessel that could carry colonists across the centuries-long gap between stars, sustaining them with onboard ecosystems until arrival. He recognized, even then, that the problem of interstellar distance was not a problem of speed. It was a problem of endurance. The idea resurfaced periodically throughout the 20th century. In 1929, physicist J.D. Bernal proposed enormous self-sustaining habitats that could carry thousands of people through space indefinitely. In the 1950s, writers and scientists began incorporating the idea into broader discussions of humanity's spacefaring future. In 1964, Robert Ensman produced what was then the most detailed generation ship design ever attempted, a 600-meter craft designed for long-duration interstellar transit. And in 1976, physicist Gerard O'Neill published detailed plans for massive rotating space habitats, cylindrical structures miles long that could simulate gravity through centripetal force and house tens of thousands of residents inside landscapes that mimicked Earth's open air. O'Neill's designs were not specifically interstellar, but they provided the architectural vocabulary that nearly every generation ship concept has drawn from since. The appeal of the generation ship is not hard to understand. It sidesteps the hardest physics entirely. You do not need faster-than-light travel. You do not need wormholes or warp drives or breakthroughs in fundamental physics that may never come. You do not even need fusion propulsion, though it would certainly help. In principle, a generation ship could be launched with propulsion technologies that are merely ambitious extensions of what exists today. The ship moves slowly, perhaps 1 to 5% the speed of light, and time does the rest. The emotional appeal runs even deeper. The generation ship carries with it the oldest narrative in human history, the Ark, the vessel that preserves life through a great crossing. Noah's flood, the Polynesian voyaging canoes, the Mayflower. Humanity has always understood the idea of loading everything precious into a vessel and sailing toward an uncertain shore. And because the narrative is familiar, the concept feels achievable. It feels like something humans are built to do. That sense of familiarity is exactly what makes the generation ship so dangerous as an idea. In 2024, the Initiative for Interstellar Studies, a UK-based non-profit dedicated to advancing interstellar research, launched the Project Hyperion Design Competition. The challenge was direct. Design a generation ship capable of carrying a human population on a 250-year journey to a habitable exoplanet using current or near-future technologies. The competition drew hundreds of submissions from interdisciplinary teams around the world. Engineers, architects, psychologists, anthropologists, and social scientists all contributed. The winners were announced in July 2025. The first-place entry was called Chrysalis, designed by an Italian team of 5 that included an architect, an astrophysicist, an environmental engineer, a psychologist, and an economic scientist. The design was staggering in its ambition. Chrysalis would measure approximately 58,000 meters from end to end. That is roughly 36 miles. It would have a diameter of 6,000 meters, nearly 4 miles across. The total mass was estimated at 2.4 billion metric tons. It would carry approximately 2,400 people and use a direct fusion drive, burning deuterium and helium-3 to achieve a cruising velocity of 1% the speed of light. The habitat section consisted of 5 concentric cylindrical shells arranged around a central core. The outermost shell was dedicated to food production and biological conservation, including forests and crop fields designed to preserve Earth's biodiversity. The next shells contained communal spaces, residences, and work areas. The innermost shells housed manufacturing, storage, and maintenance facilities. The design even included parks, schools, and libraries. It was, on paper, a self-sustaining world. But the Chrysalis team did something that most generation ship proposals do not. They took the human dimension seriously enough to be disturbed by it. In their design brief, they proposed that the initial crew should not simply be selected and loaded aboard. Instead, they recommended that 3 to 4 generations of prospective passengers live in experimental biosphere colonies in Antarctica for 70 to 80 years before departure. The purpose was not merely physical acclimatization. It was psychological screening across multiple generations, an attempt to confirm that the population could withstand enclosed, resource-limited, socially isolated life before committing them to a vessel from which there would be no return. 70 to 80 years of preparation in Antarctica before even boarding the ship. That single design requirement should tell you everything about how seriously the people who study this problem take the human challenges involved. The competition judges praised Chrysalis for its system-level coherence and depth of detail, particularly its integration of governance structures, psychological support strategies, and mission phase planning. But even the judges acknowledged unresolved questions. How do the rotating habitat sections interface mechanically? How is artificial gravity distributed across different shells? And beneath those engineering questions, a much larger silence. The design can describe what the ship looks like. It can describe what the routines might be. It cannot guarantee that the society inside will still be functional in 100 years, let alone 250. Here is where the comparison to every previous human journey breaks down irreversibly. When the Polynesians crossed the Pacific, the voyage lasted weeks or months. The crew who departed were the crew who arrived. Their language, culture, identity, and purpose remained intact because the crossing was short enough to be survived by a single, continuous group of people. The same is true for every other migration in human history. The Mayflower crossing took 66 days. The first fleet to Australia took roughly 8 months. Even the longest overland migrations in human prehistory, the slow dispersal of populations across continents over thousands of years, were not enclosed. People could stop, they could settle, they could turn back, they could encounter other groups, trade, fight, absorb new ideas. The journey was open, the environment changed around them. They adapted in real time to real conditions with real freedom of movement. A generation ship permits none of this. The environment does not change. The walls are the same walls for every generation. The air is the same recycled air. The food is grown from the same soil, processed through the same systems, eaten in the same compartments. There is no outside. There is no weather. There is no horizon. There are no strangers. There is no discovery on the road, because there is no road. There is only the interior of a machine, and the people who happen to be alive inside it at any given moment. And those people did not choose to be there. The people who board at departure carry the weight of their own decision. But within a generation, the ship is filled with people who carry a different weight entirely. By the 5th generation, every person aboard was born into a world they had no hand in creating, committed to a journey they never agreed to, sustained by systems they are obligated to maintain not because they want to, but because the alternative is death by suffocation, starvation, or mechanical failure in the emptiness between stars. No previous ark carried that burden. Noah's passengers, mythological or not, endured weeks. The Mayflower passengers endured months. A generation ship asks people to endure lifetimes. Not one lifetime, dozens of them. Stacked end to end inside a sealed corridor with no exit and no voice in the decision that put them there. This is the fracture that hides beneath every beautiful rendering of an O'Neill cylinder with green hills curving upward toward an artificial sun. The image is gorgeous. The reality underneath it is a question that no one has answered. How do you maintain a functioning civilization, a civilization with laws, purpose, social cohesion, technical competence, reproductive stability, psychological health, and meaning, inside a closed container where the margin for failure is zero and the timeline is measured in centuries? The answer that most proposals offer is design, better architecture, smarter systems, redundant life support, rotating leadership structures, psychological screening, genetic planning, and all of those things are necessary, but none of them address the deeper problem, which is that a generation ship is not a long mission. It is a permanent condition imposed on people who never volunteered for it. Every submarine deployment ends. Every Antarctic overwinter ends. Every space station rotation ends. The crew goes home. They see the sky. They eat fresh food. They hug someone who was not locked inside the same metal tube for the last 6 months. The psychological endurance required for those missions is real, and even then, depression, conflict, sleep disruption, and social fragmentation are well-documented outcomes. Even on Earth, the longest high-fidelity isolation experiments, simulations lasting less than 2 years with small crews who volunteered and who knew the door would eventually open, have produced measurable psychological deterioration that the participants did not anticipate and the designers did not fully prevent. Now, remove the door. Remove the end date. Remove the knowledge that outside the walls there is a planet, with sunlight and open air waiting for you. Replace all of that with the understanding that you were born inside this vessel, that your parents were born inside this vessel, that your children will be born inside this vessel, and that the destination is still so far away that no one alive today will live to see it. That is not a mission, that is an existence. And the question of whether human beings can sustain a healthy, functional, purposeful existence under those conditions for centuries is not an engineering question. It is a question about the limits of what human psychology, human society, and human meaning can withstand. The generation ship is the most elegant idea in interstellar travel. It is also, on close inspection, the most terrifying, because it does not merely propose sending humans across the void between stars. It proposes creating a new kind of human society, one that has never existed before, one that operates under constraints no civilization has ever faced, and then sealing that society inside a machine and hoping it holds together long enough for the math to work out. The math might work, the ship might hold, the recyclers might cycle, the fusion reactor might burn, but the people inside are not math. They are not components. They are human beings with needs that extend far beyond oxygen and calories. They need purpose. They need autonomy. They need hope. They need the sense that their lives are their own, not instruments of a project designed by strangers who died before they were born. And that is only the beginning of the problem, because everything discussed so far assumes the ship works, that the system functions, that the food grows, that the air stays breathable, that nothing breaks in a way that cannot be fixed. What comes next will show why that assumption is the most dangerous fantasy of all. Because humanity has already tried to build a closed, self-sustaining world. It was 3.14 acres in the Arizona desert. It held 8 people, and it nearly killed them in less than 2 years. In 1991, in the high desert outside Oracle, Arizona, 8 scientists walked through an airlock and sealed themselves inside the most ambitious ecological experiment ever attempted. The structure they entered was called Biosphere 2, 3.14 acres of enclosed space, the largest materially closed ecological system ever constructed, designed to prove that human beings could survive inside a self-sustaining, sealed environment without any exchange of matter with the outside world. The facility was extraordinary. Built between 1987 and 1991 at a cost of roughly $150 million, it contained 5 ecological biomes modeled on Earth's major ecosystems, plus an agricultural zone and a human habitat. There was a tropical rainforest, a savanna grassland, a mangrove wetland, a small ocean with a coral reef, a fog desert. The agricultural section was designed to produce all the food for the crew, and the human habitat contained living quarters, laboratories, and workspace. The structure was sealed beneath glass and steel. Sunlight entered. Electrical energy was supplied from outside. But no air, no water, no food, and no material of any kind was supposed to cross the boundary in either direction. The crew would breathe what the plants produced. They would eat what the soil grew. They would drink what the water cycle recycled. Everything inside would sustain everything else in a continuous loop, just as it does on Earth itself. That was the theory. The reality became one of the most instructive failures in the history of science. Within the first year, oxygen levels inside Biosphere 2 began dropping. Not slightly, dangerously. The concentration fell from the normal 20.9% to approximately 14.2%. That is equivalent to the oxygen level at an altitude of roughly 13,400 feet, comparable to living partway up a major Himalayan peak without acclimatization. The crew experienced chronic fatigue, impaired cognitive function, and difficulty performing basic tasks. They were, in effect, slowly suffocating inside a building in the Arizona desert. The cause took months to identify. Microorganisms in the soil, far more numerous and active than the designers had anticipated, were consuming oxygen as they decomposed organic matter. The carbon dioxide they released was supposed to be absorbed by the plants and converted back to oxygen through photosynthesis. But the system was not balanced. Concrete structural elements inside the facility were absorbing carbon dioxide through a chemical reaction with calcium hydroxide, effectively removing it from the atmospheric cycle before the plants could use it. The carbon was being locked away. The oxygen it had been bonded to was being consumed. The loop that was supposed to be closed had a leak, not to the outside, but into the structure itself. To prevent medical emergency, the project managers made a decision that effectively ended the experiment's primary claim. They pumped supplemental oxygen into the facility from outside. The seal was broken. The closed system was no longer closed. But the oxygen crisis was not the only failure. The agricultural system, carefully designed to produce a balanced diet for 8 people, fell short of caloric requirements. The crew reported constant hunger throughout the first mission. They lost an average of roughly 14 to 18% of their body weight. Crop yields were lower than predicted because light levels inside the glass enclosure were reduced compared to open-air conditions, and pollinator populations collapsed early in the mission. Most of the insect species introduced to the facility died. Cockroaches and a species of ant called crazy ants thrived in the absence of their natural competitors, overrunning multiple biome areas. The coral reef declined. Morning glories, an aggressive vine, invaded the rainforest section and began choking out other species. The majority of the small vertebrate species introduced into the facility went extinct during the first 2-year mission, with some accounts placing the loss at 19 of 25 species. And then there were the people. 8 scientists, selected and screened, all volunteers, all deeply committed to the mission, all aware that the experiment had an end date and that the door would open. Within months, the group fractured into 2 hostile factions. Communication between the factions broke down. Accusations of sabotage and dishonesty circulated. Morale collapsed. The social dynamics inside 3.14 acres of enclosed space deteriorated so badly that several crew members later described the interpersonal conflict as the single worst aspect of the entire experience. Worse than the hunger, worse than the thin air. The second Biosphere 2 mission, launched in 1994 with a new crew, was terminated early after only 6 months. Not because of ecological failure this time, but because of management disputes and external conflicts that penetrated the project's organizational structure. No further sealed system human habitation experiments have been conducted at that scale since. Biosphere 2 is not a footnote in the history of space exploration. It is a warning written in bold. And the warning is this: humanity's single attempt to build a closed, self-sustaining world on the surface of its own planet, with unlimited access to repair materials, with the full resources of a global economy standing by, with engineers and biologists available for consultation at any hour, with a medical team on call just outside the glass, with the certain knowledge that the experiment would end and the door would open, failed. It failed ecologically. It failed nutritionally. It failed socially. It failed within 2 years. A generation ship must do what Biosphere 2 could not. But it must do it for centuries, without resupply, without consultation from outside experts, without the psychological safety net of a door that opens, without replacement parts delivered from a factory that no longer exists, without the planet that manufactured every material, trained every technician, and grew every seed that the ship carries aboard. The challenge of maintaining a closed life support system aboard a generation ship is not a single problem. It is a cascade of interlocking problems, each of which must be solved perfectly and simultaneously for as long as the mission lasts, with the additional constraint that every solution must be maintained by people who have never been to Earth, and who learned their skills from people who also never went to Earth. Start with air. A population of several thousand people consumes hundreds of thousands of liters of oxygen per day. On a generation ship, that oxygen must come from photosynthetic organisms, whether traditional crop plants, engineered algae systems, or some combination. Those organisms require light, water, carbon dioxide, and nutrients in precise ratios. The light must be artificially generated because no starlight reaches the interior. The energy to produce that light must come from onboard reactors. The nutrients must come from recycled waste. The carbon dioxide must come from the same population whose oxygen consumption demands the system exist in the first place. This is the fundamental architecture of a closed atmospheric loop. And the critical feature of any loop is that it has no buffer. On Earth, the atmosphere contains roughly 1.09 quadrillion metric tons of oxygen. If global photosynthesis dropped by 10% for a year, humans would not notice. The reservoir is so vast that fluctuations are absorbed without consequence. Inside a generation ship, the atmospheric reservoir is whatever volume the vessel contains. A significant disruption to the photosynthetic system, a crop blight, an algae die-off, a lighting failure in a grow section, translates directly and immediately into a decline in breathable air. There is no external reservoir to draw from. There is no margin hiding in a vast planetary atmosphere. The margin is what you built, and nothing more. Water follows the same logic, but introduces additional complexity. Every drop of water aboard a generation ship at departure is every drop of water that will ever exist aboard that ship. There is no rain falling from clouds fed by an ocean. There is no aquifer slowly recharging beneath the ground. There is only the water that was loaded into the tanks, cycled through human bodies, collected as waste, purified, redistributed to agriculture, transpired by plants, condensed, collected again, and cycled back through human bodies once more. Every molecule of water on that ship must make that loop thousands of times across the duration of the mission. Modern water recycling aboard the International Space Station, after decades of refinement, now achieves a recovery rate of approximately 98%. That sounds nearly perfect. On a 6-month rotation, it is more than sufficient. On a generation ship operating for centuries, even a 2% loss rate per cycle would steadily drain the system over decades. The recovery rate must approach effectively 100%, sustained not for months, but for longer than any mechanical system in human history has ever operated continuously. And water purity is not simply a matter of filtration. Trace contaminants accumulate. Pharmaceutical residues excreted by the human population pass through recycling systems and re-enter the water supply unless specifically removed. Endocrine disruptors, heavy metals leached from piping, bacterial biofilms that colonize filtration membranes, all of these must be managed continuously. On Earth, these contaminants are diluted by the sheer volume of the hydrological cycle. On a generation ship, there is no dilution. Every contaminant that is not actively removed concentrates over time. A filtration system that performs at 99.9% efficiency still allows 0.1% of contaminants through on every pass. Run that loop 10,000 times and the residual fraction is no longer negligible. It is the water supply. Food production introduces what may be the most fragile link in the entire chain: biosphere. 2. Demonstrated that growing sufficient calories in a closed system is harder than it appears, even under conditions far more favorable than a spacecraft interior. A generation ship must produce all calories, all essential amino acids, all vitamins, all micronutrients from onboard agriculture operating under artificial light in recycled soil with recycled water indefinitely. The margin for crop failure is effectively zero. A single growing season lost to blight, fungal contamination, or pest infestation cannot be compensated by imports. There are no imports. Seed stocks must be preserved across centuries. Soil microbiology, the complex community of bacteria, fungi, and invertebrates that make soil fertile, must be maintained without access to the planetary biosphere that created and sustains those communities on Earth. Consider what soil actually is. It is not dirt. It is one of the most complex biological systems on the planet. A single teaspoon of healthy agricultural soil contains more microorganisms than there are people on Earth. Those organisms break down organic matter, fix nitrogen, make phosphorus available to plant roots, suppress pathogens, and maintain the physical structure that allows roots to grow and water to drain. On Earth, this community is continuously refreshed by inputs from the surrounding environment, wind-borne spores, insect activity, animal waste, decomposing vegetation from adjacent ecosystems. On a generation ship, the soil community is isolated. It will evolve. It will change. Species within it will go extinct. Others will dominate. Whether the resulting soil remains agriculturally productive after 5 generations, 10 generations, 20 generations of isolation and recycling is a question that no experiment has ever tested, because no experiment has ever run that long. Trace elements add another dimension of compounding risk. Human nutrition requires more than calories. It requires zinc, selenium, iodine, manganese, molybdenum, copper, and dozens of other elements in small but non-negotiable quantities. These elements must be present in the soil that grows the food. On Earth, they are replenished by geological weathering, rainfall carrying dissolved minerals from rock, and the slow cycling of material through the planet's crust. On a generation ship, the total inventory of every trace element is fixed at departure. Whatever amount of selenium, for example, is present in the soil, the water, and the stored materials at launch is the total amount of selenium that will ever be available. If any fraction of it becomes chemically locked in a form that plants cannot absorb or accumulates in waste that the recycling system cannot fully recover, or is lost to mechanical processes like corrosion or outgassing, the available supply shrinks. It shrinks by a small amount each cycle, and it never grows back. A 0.1% annual loss of any essential trace element sounds trivial. Over 10 years, it is a 1% reduction. Over 100 years, it is roughly 10%. Over 500 years, it is a deficit large enough to produce clinical deficiency in the entire population. Selenium deficiency causes immune dysfunction, thyroid disease, and cardiomyopathy. Iodine deficiency causes goiter and cognitive impairment. Zinc deficiency impairs wound healing, growth, and reproductive health. These are not hypothetical consequences. They are well-documented medical outcomes of specific nutritional gaps. And on a generation ship, they would emerge slowly, across generations, becoming the new normal for a population that has no way to supplement what has been lost. Now add energy. Every system described so far, atmospheric cycling, water purification, agricultural lighting, temperature regulation, waste processing, requires continuous energy input. The most commonly proposed energy source for a generation ship is nuclear fusion, the same process that powers stars. Fusion reactors do not yet exist in commercially viable form on Earth, but the physics is well understood, and several experimental programs are progressing towards sustained fusion power. For the purposes of a generation ship, fusion offers the highest energy density of any known technology, meaning the most energy output per unit of fuel mass. The Chrysalis design, the winning entry in the 2025 Project Hyperion competition, specified toroidal fusion reactors burning deuterium and helium-3, distributed throughout the ship's structure with multiple redundancy to tolerate individual reactor failures. This is sound engineering philosophy, but it rests on an assumption that deserves scrutiny. Those reactors must operate continuously for the entire duration of the mission, not for a decade, not for a human lifetime, for centuries. No machine built by human hands has ever operated continuously for centuries. The oldest functioning mechanical clocks in Europe date to the 14th century, roughly 700 years old, but they have been repaired, rebuilt, and maintained continuously by skilled artisans across that entire period, with access to replacement parts, raw materials, and the accumulated knowledge of a civilization. A fusion reactor aboard a generation ship must be maintained by the ship's population using only materials available aboard the ship, manufactured by facilities aboard the ship, operated by people trained aboard the ship. Every replacement part must be fabricated from stored raw materials or recycled components. Every maintenance procedure must be taught, learned, practiced, and transmitted to the next generation without corruption, simplification, or loss. This is the knowledge transfer problem, and it may be the most underestimated risk in the entire generation ship concept. On Earth, technical knowledge is preserved and transmitted through an enormous, redundant network of institutions, universities, libraries, apprenticeship systems, professional organizations, publishing houses, digital archives, and the continuous practice of millions of specialists working in every field simultaneously. If a particular skill becomes rare, the system compensates. Experts are recruited from other regions. Training programs are expanded. Textbooks are revised. Knowledge circulates through a civilization of billions, and the loss of any single node, any single expert, any single institution does not threaten the survival of the whole. On a generation ship carrying a few thousand people, every field of critical expertise must be maintained by a tiny number of specialists. The ship needs fusion engineers, atmospheric chemists, agricultural biologists, water treatment technicians, medical doctors, surgeons, pharmacologists, electrical engineers, structural engineers, software developers, metallurgists, machinists, and dozens of other specializations, all simultaneously, all continuously, across every generation. If a single generation fails to produce a qualified fusion engineer, not because the knowledge was lost, but simply because no one in that cohort had the aptitude or interest, the entire energy system becomes dependent on people who are less competent than their predecessors. Compound that across multiple fields and multiple generations, and the erosion is not hypothetical. It is demographic inevitability. There is a name for what happens when a small, isolated population attempts to maintain a complex technological system across long time periods without external input. Anthropologists call it technological regression. It has happened repeatedly in human history. The most famous example is Tasmania. When rising sea levels severed Tasmania from mainland Australia roughly 10,000 years ago, the Aboriginal Tasmanian population, estimated at a few thousand people, was isolated on an island with no further contact with the mainland population. Over the following millennia, the Tasmanians lost several technologies that their ancestors had possessed at the time of separation, including bone tools, cold weather clothing, and the ability to make fire from scratch in some accounts. The population was not less intelligent than their mainland relatives. They simply lacked the population size and connectivity needed to maintain the full breadth of their technological repertoire. Skills that were practiced by only a few specialists were vulnerable to loss when those specialists died without fully transmitting their knowledge. Once lost, the skills could not be relearned because the larger network that had originally developed them was no longer accessible. A generation ship is Tasmania, surrounded by vacuum. The population is small. The isolation is total. The technological demands are not modest. They are the most complex life support engineering ever conceived. Every generation must not only maintain existing knowledge, but train the next generation to a standard high enough to maintain systems that will degrade, corrode, fatigue, and fail in ways that the original designers may not have fully anticipated. A pipe that was rated for a 50-year service life must be replaced by Generation 3. The replacement must be manufactured aboard the ship from materials that were either stockpiled or recycled. The manufacturing process must be understood, operated, and quality controlled by people who have never seen a factory on Earth, who learned from people who also never saw a factory on Earth. And here is the compounding dimension that makes all of this worse than any individual problem suggests. These systems are not independent. They are coupled. The atmospheric system depends on the agricultural system, which depends on the water system, which depends on the energy system, which depends on the maintenance system, which depends on the knowledge transfer system, which depends on the social and educational system, which depends on the governance system. A failure in any one link does not produce a single isolated problem. It produces a cascade. Reduced crop yields reduce oxygen production. Reduced oxygen impairs cognitive function. Impaired cognition reduces maintenance quality. Reduced maintenance quality increases the risk of mechanical failure. Mechanical failure in the water recycling system reduces water availability. Reduced water reduces crop yields further. The loop tightens. On Earth, cascading failures are buffered by scale. A regional crop failure is compensated by imports from other regions. A power grid failure is repaired by crews supplied from unaffected areas. A disease outbreak is contained by medical resources drawn from a global system. On a generation ship, every buffer is internal. Every reserve is finite. Every failure draws from the same limited pool of resources, expertise, and human energy. And every draw from that pool reduces what is available for the next failure. The engineers who design generation ships understand this. The Chrysalis team built multiple redundancy into every critical system, multiple fusion reactors, multiple grow sections, multiple water recycling trains. Redundancy is the engineer's answer to fragility, and it is a good answer for short-duration missions, but redundancy has a cost. Every backup system requires maintenance. Every backup system requires spare parts. Every backup system requires trained operators. Over centuries, redundancy does not eliminate failure, it delays it, and it increases the total maintenance burden on a population that is already stretched to the limits of what a small, isolated group can sustain. There is a concept in reliability engineering called the bathtub curve. It describes the failure rate of mechanical systems over time. Early in a system's life, failure rates are relatively high as manufacturing defects reveal themselves. The rate then drops to a low, stable plateau during the system's useful life. And then, as the system ages, the failure rate climbs again as materials fatigue, seals degrade, and components wear beyond their design limits. For most engineered systems on Earth, the rising tail of the bathtub curve is managed by replacement. You retire the old machine and install a new one, built in a factory with fresh materials and current knowledge. On a generation ship, there is no factory with fresh materials. There are fabrication facilities that must themselves be maintained and supplied from the same closed resource loop as everything else. And the bathtub curve does not apply only to individual components. It applies to every system aboard the vessels simultaneously. As the mission progresses, more and more systems enter the rising failure portion of their life cycle at the same time. The maintenance burden does not grow linearly. It grows as a curve that steepens with age. The ship becomes harder to keep alive with every passing decade. This is what it means to say that a generation ship eats itself. Not through a single dramatic failure, not through an explosion or a breach or a collision with a rogue asteroid, through the slow, relentless accumulation of small losses, a fraction of a percent of oxygen not recovered, a trace mineral locked in an unrecoverable compound, a pipe joint that fatigued 10 years before the maintenance schedule predicted, a filtration membrane colonized by a biofilm that resists the standard cleaning protocol. A crop variety that lost a critical gene through genetic drift in the seed stock, a technician who retired before fully training a replacement. Each of these is manageable in isolation. Together, compounded across decades, across centuries, they are the mechanism by which a closed system devours its own capacity to sustain the life inside it. And none of this accounts for the unexpected. The corrosion pathway no designer anticipated. The microbial mutation that produces a toxin the water system was not designed to filter. The structural fatigue in a section of hull that was rated for 300 years but encounters a vibration harmonic that the original stress analysis did not model. On Earth, the unexpected is met by the full creative capacity of a global civilization improvising solutions in real time. On a generation ship, the unexpected is met by a few thousand people with whatever tools, materials, and knowledge they happen to have aboard, and nothing else. And there is a threat that does not come from inside the ship at all. It comes from the space the ship moves through, and it never stops. Interstellar space is not empty. It is saturated with radiation. Two distinct types of radiation would bombard a generation ship continuously across the entire duration of its voyage. The first is galactic cosmic radiation, a constant rain of high-energy particles, primarily protons and heavier atomic nuclei, accelerated to enormous velocities by supernova shockwaves and other violent astrophysical processes scattered across the galaxy. The second is solar particle radiation, bursts of high-energy protons ejected by stellar flares. Once the ship leaves the protective influence of our sun's heliosphere, the magnetic bubble that partially shields the inner solar system from galactic cosmic rays, it enters an environment where radiation exposure is significantly higher than anything experienced in low Earth orbit. NASA has studied the biological effects of galactic cosmic radiation extensively in preparation for potential Mars missions. The findings are not reassuring. Unlike the X-rays or gamma rays used in medical imaging, galactic cosmic rays include heavy ions, particles with high atomic numbers traveling at significant fractions of the speed of light. When these ions pass through biological tissue, they do not merely deposit energy along a narrow track the way lighter radiation does. They shatter molecular bonds along a wide corridor of destruction, damaging DNA in ways that the body's repair mechanisms struggle to fix. The result is an elevated risk of cancer, cardiovascular disease, cataracts, and central nervous system damage that accumulates with exposure duration. On the International Space Station, astronauts receive roughly 200 to 300 millisieverts of radiation per year, sheltered partially by Earth's magnetosphere. Outside that protection, in interstellar space, the dose rate would be higher. Estimates vary depending on shielding assumptions, but a minimally shielded crew in deep space could receive 400 to 600 millisieverts per year or more. Over a 30-year adult lifespan, that is 12 to 18 sieverts of cumulative exposure. For comparison, the lifetime dose limit recommended by most space agencies is approximately 1 sievert. The generation ship population would exceed that limit within a few years of departure. Shielding is the obvious response, but effective shielding against galactic cosmic rays is extraordinarily difficult. The most energetic particles cannot be stopped by any practical thickness of metal. Worse, when heavy ions strike dense shielding materials like steel or lead, they produce secondary particle showers, cascades of neutrons and lighter fragments that can be more biologically damaging than the original particle. The best shielding materials are hydrogen-rich substances like water and polyethylene, which absorb energy without producing as many secondary particles. Some generation ship designs propose using the water supply itself as a radiation shield, encasing the habitat in a shell of water tanks. This is clever, but it means that the radiation shield and the water recycling system are the same infrastructure. A leak in the shield is a leak in the water supply. A failure in one is a failure in both. Even with optimized shielding, some radiation will penetrate. Over centuries, the cumulative genetic damage to a breeding population is not trivial. Radiation-induced mutations accumulate in the germline, the eggs, and sperm that produce the next generation. Most mutations are neutral or harmful. Beneficial mutations are extraordinarily rare. In a small population already under pressure from reduced genetic diversity, the additional mutational load imposed by chronic radiation exposure accelerates the degradation of the gene pool. The effect is slow, generational, invisible at any single point in time, and essentially irreversible without access to genetic engineering capabilities that may or may not be maintainable aboard the ship across centuries. This means the ship is not merely fighting entropy in its mechanical systems, its atmosphere, its water, and its soil. It is fighting entropy in the bodies of its passengers. The people themselves are being slowly damaged by the environment they are traveling through, and the damage is heritable. Each generation passes to the next, not only its culture and its knowledge, but also its accumulated genetic injuries. The ship does not need to suffer a dramatic radiation event to be harmed. The harm is continuous, silent, and compounding. There is another system that every generation ship proposal quietly depends on, but rarely examines in detail: medicine. On Earth, modern healthcare is the product of a global industrial ecosystem of almost incomprehensible complexity. A single hospital relies on pharmaceutical supply chains that span dozens of countries. Surgical instruments are manufactured by specialized firms with decades of accumulated expertise. Imaging equipment, MRI machines, CT scanners, ultrasound devices requires precision manufacturing, rare earth elements, and software maintained by teams of engineers. Disposable supplies, syringes, sutures, sterile gloves, catheters, are produced in factories that consume raw materials sourced from every continent. A single course of antibiotics involves chemical synthesis pathways that depend on precursor compounds manufactured in facilities the hospital never sees. A generation ship must replicate enough of this system to keep its population alive and healthy for centuries. That means onboard pharmaceutical manufacturing, surgical capability, diagnostic imaging, dental care, obstetric care, neonatal intensive care, and management of chronic diseases, all sustained by a population of a few thousand people using only materials available within the hull. Consider pharmaceuticals alone. Modern medicine relies on thousands of distinct drug compounds synthesized through complex chemical processes or produced by engineered cell cultures under carefully controlled growth conditions. Stockpiling a centuries-long supply is impractical because most pharmaceuticals have shelf lives measured in months to years, not decades. The ship must manufacture its own drugs from raw chemical feedstocks, which means it must carry or produce those feedstocks, maintain the reactors and bioreactors that process them, and train pharmacologists and chemists in every generation who are capable of operating and troubleshooting the manufacturing systems. If pharmaceutical manufacturing capability degrades, the consequences are not abstract. Antibiotics become unavailable, and bacterial infections that are trivially treatable on Earth become fatal aboard the ship. Anesthetics become unavailable, and surgery reverts to a pre-modern horror. Insulin becomes unavailable, and every diabetic in the population dies. Anticonvulsants become unavailable, and epilepsy becomes unmanageable. The population's effective medical technology regresses not by choice, but by attrition, as the systems required to produce modern medicine slowly exceed the capacity of the ship's diminishing industrial base to maintain. Surgical capability faces a similar erosion pathway. Surgical instruments wear out, dull, and break. Replacements must be manufactured to precise tolerances from appropriate materials. Surgical training requires not just theoretical knowledge but hands-on practice, which means the population must produce enough surgical cases to keep its surgeons skilled. A grim arithmetic that depends on the rate of injury and illness in a population that may be too small to generate sufficient caseload for every specialty. A ship carrying 2,000 people cannot sustain a neurosurgeon, a cardiac surgeon, an orthopedic surgeon, and a vascular surgeon simultaneously across every generation. The specializations will collapse into generalism, and generalism means reduced capability for every complex procedure. The medical regression of a generation ship is not a dramatic event. It is a slow narrowing of what is treatable, a gradual acceptance that conditions which would be routine on Earth are now fatal aboard the ship, a quiet redefinition of normal life expectancy downward as the population loses access to the interventions that extended it. After 5 generations, the medical system aboard the ship may more closely resemble the 19th century than the 21st. After 10, it may resemble the medieval period for any condition that requires advanced intervention. The people aboard will not experience this as a catastrophe. They will experience it as the way things have always been, because they will have no memory of anything better. The engineering optimist looks at these challenges and sees problems to be solved. Better materials, smarter designs, more robust recycling, artificial intelligence to assist with maintenance scheduling and failure prediction. And those responses are not wrong, they are necessary. Every improvement in closed system engineering brings the concept closer to feasibility. But the engineering optimist is solving the wrong layer of the problem. Because even if every mechanical system aboard a generation ship functions perfectly for the entire duration of the mission, even if the air stays breathable and the water stays clean, and the crops grow and the reactors burn, and every pipe holds and every seal remains tight, there is still the matter of the people inside. The people who must govern themselves without a constitution that has ever been tested under these conditions. The people who must reproduce at rates determined not by desire, but by carrying capacity. The people who must maintain psychological health inside an environment that violates every evolutionary expectation the human brain was shaped to meet. The people who must hold together as a society for longer than any society in recorded history has ever held together, under pressures that no society has ever faced. The ship can be built, perhaps with enough resources, enough time, enough ingenuity. But can the civilization inside it be built? Can it be maintained? Can it survive itself? That question is where the real terror begins. And the evidence from every study of confined, isolated, small human groups points in a direction that should make anyone who romanticizes the generation ship concept pause and consider what they are actually proposing to do to the people who would live inside it. Every generation ship concept ever proposed begins with the same implicit assumption that the people inside will cooperate, that they will follow the rules, that they will do their jobs, raise their children responsibly, resolve their conflicts peacefully, and sustain a shared commitment to a mission that most of them will never see completed. The assumption is so fundamental that it is rarely examined directly. Engineers design the hull, biologists design the ecosystem, physicists design the drive, and then, almost as an afterthought, someone writes a paragraph about governance and social structure, as if organizing a multi-generational human society under unprecedented conditions were a detail to be handled after the reactor specifications are finalized. It is not a detail, it is the problem. And every discipline that studies human behavior under confinement, isolation, and resource constraint has produced evidence suggesting that the social challenge of a generation ship dwarfs the engineering challenge by an order of magnitude that most people do not want to confront. Begin with the most basic biological question. How many people does the ship need to carry? The answer depends on what you are optimizing for. If you are optimizing for genetic viability, the question becomes, how large must the founding population be to sustain sufficient genetic diversity across dozens of generations without collapsing into inbreeding depression? Inbreeding depression is not a theoretical concern. It is a measurable, well-documented biological phenomenon in which reduced genetic diversity leads to increased expression of deleterious recessive alleles. The consequences include reduced fertility, increased infant mortality, impaired immune function, and elevated rates of congenital disease. In small, isolated populations, these effects compound with each generation. The smaller the founding population and the longer the isolation, the faster the genetic damage accumulates. Anthropologist John Moore, studying the question specifically in the context of interstellar travel, estimated that a founding population of approximately 160 individuals could sustain genetic health across a 200-year journey, provided that reproductive pairings were carefully managed to maximize outbreeding. With social controls such as delayed reproduction, the minimum could be reduced to roughly 80 people. Moore's estimates assumed a relatively short mission and a population that accepted significant external management of its reproductive behavior. Other researchers reached dramatically different conclusions. Cameron Smith, an anthropologist at Portland State University, constructed detailed population simulations and found that Moore's numbers were dangerously optimistic. Smith's models accounted for catastrophic events, plagues, accidents, equipment failures that could kill a significant fraction of the population in a single episode. When those risks were included, the minimum viable population jumped to approximately 10,000 individuals. Smith argued that 40,000 would be a safer number, providing enough genetic diversity and demographic resilience to absorb severe losses without entering a death spiral of inbreeding and population decline. The gap between those estimates is staggering. 160 people versus 40,000. The difference is not a matter of fine-tuning. It reflects fundamentally different assumptions about how much risk is acceptable, how much reproductive control is enforceable, and how many catastrophic events a population can absorb across the duration of the mission. And embedded in every one of these estimates is a requirement that should disturb anyone who values human autonomy. Genetic viability in a small, closed population requires managed reproduction, not suggested reproduction, not encouraged reproduction, managed reproduction. Someone, or some system, must determine who reproduces with whom. Pairings that would increase homozygosity must be discouraged or prohibited. Individuals who carry dangerous recessive combinations must be identified and their reproductive options constrained. Family sizes must be regulated to prevent population overshoot, which would overwhelm the life support system, or population decline, which would threaten genetic diversity and workforce capacity simultaneously. This is not family planning in the sense that modern societies practice it, where individuals make private choices, supported by access to information and contraception. This is centralized reproductive oversight enforced by necessity. The survival of the population depends on compliance. An individual who refuses to follow reproductive guidelines, who chooses a partner based on love rather than genetic compatibility, who has more children than the system permits, or who declines to have children at all, is not merely exercising personal freedom. They are imposing risk on every other person aboard the ship. Their choice ripples forward through generations, affecting genetic health, population balance, and resource allocation for decades after they are dead. No human society has ever maintained this kind of reproductive control voluntarily for more than a few generations. Attempts to impose eugenic programs in the 20th century produced some of the worst moral catastrophes in recorded history. The generation ship does not require eugenics in the ideological sense. It requires genetic management in the operational sense. But the distinction between those two things, between managing reproduction for survival and managing reproduction for ideology, is a line that would blur rapidly inside a closed society under pressure, with no external oversight, no press, no courts of appeal, and no exit for anyone who objects. Governance compounds this problem in every direction. Consider what a generation ship actually requires from its political system. It requires stability across a time span longer than any government in human history has persisted without fundamental transformation. The Roman Republic lasted roughly 5 centuries before becoming an empire. The Byzantine Empire lasted roughly 1,000 years, but underwent continuous structural change, civil wars, coups, and theological crises throughout its existence. The longest surviving continuous political systems on Earth, including constitutional monarchies and certain indigenous governance traditions, have endured for centuries, only through constant adaptation to changing conditions, external pressures, and the cycling of ideas through contact with other cultures. A generation ship permits none of those adaptive mechanisms. There is no external pressure to respond to. There are no neighboring states to compete with, trade with, or learn from. There are no new immigrants bringing different perspectives. There is no frontier to absorb dissidents. There is no wilderness to escape into. The political system must function inside a sealed vessel where every citizen is simultaneously a dependent, a worker, and a captive. Dissent cannot emigrate. Opposition cannot organize in private, because there is no private space that is not ultimately under the jurisdiction of the ship's systems. And revolution, the mechanism by which most historical political systems have been replaced when they became intolerable, carries an existential risk that no terrestrial revolution has ever carried. A revolution aboard a generation ship risks damaging the life support infrastructure on which every single person, including the revolutionaries, depends for survival. And governance is not only a question of structure and stability, it is a question of enforcement. Every society produces individuals who violate its rules. Theft, violence, sabotage, fraud, sexual assault, and murder have appeared in every human community that has ever existed, regardless of size, culture, or political organization. The question for a generation ship is not whether crime will occur. It is how crime can be addressed in a system where every traditional mechanism of justice is either impossible or catastrophically expensive. On Earth, justice systems rely on a small number of core mechanisms. Imprisonment removes the offender from the community for a period of time. Exile or banishment removes them permanently. Fines transfer resources from the offender to the community or the victim. Rehabilitation attempts to modify the offender's behavior and return them to productive participation. And, in some systems, capital punishment removes the offender from existence entirely. Each of these mechanisms carries costs that are absorbed by the larger society. On a generation ship, every one of these mechanisms becomes problematic in ways that have no clean resolution. Imprisonment consumes scarce resources. A person in confinement must still be fed, given water, provided with breathable air, and housed in a space that could otherwise serve a productive function. In a system operating near its carrying capacity, every imprisoned individual represents a net drain on resources that the population cannot afford. Long-term imprisonment of even a small number of individuals becomes a measurable burden on the life support system. Exile is impossible. There is nowhere to send a person. The only exterior is vacuum. Capital punishment reduces the population. In a community of a few thousand people, where every individual represents a significant fraction of the genetic diversity and labor capacity of the whole, executing an offender is not merely a moral decision. It is a demographic one. It removes genes from the gene pool. It removes a pair of hands from the workforce. If the executed individual possessed specialized technical knowledge, that knowledge may be lost permanently. And executions create factional resentment in small communities where everyone knows everyone, potentially destabilizing the social cohesion on which the ship's survival depends. Rehabilitation requires trained specialists, dedicated facilities, and a body of psychological and behavioral knowledge that must be maintained across generations. The ship must produce not only engineers and farmers, but therapists, counselors, and experts in behavioral modification continuously in every generation. Fines and restorative justice mechanisms may work for minor offenses but do not address violence. And violence aboard a generation ship carries risks beyond the immediate harm to the victim. A fight that damages a control panel, an act of sabotage directed at a rival that inadvertently compromises a water recycling unit, a murder that removes the only person aboard who understands a particular maintenance procedure. Each of these events has consequences that ripple outward through the entire closed system in ways that terrestrial violence does not. The justice problem is not a peripheral concern, it is a structural one. Every generation will produce individuals whose behavior threatens the community. The community must respond, and every available response carries costs that a sealed, resource-limited society may not be able to bear. The result is a system that must either tolerate a level of antisocial behavior that would be unacceptable in any terrestrial society, or impose forms of social control so comprehensive and invasive that the distinction between governance and totalitarianism becomes difficult to maintain. This creates a political trap with no clean exit. If the governance system becomes authoritarian, oppressive, or corrupt, the population has no recourse that does not threaten their own survival. If the governance system is too democratic, too responsive to short-term popular pressure, it may fail to enforce the long-term constraints, reproductive management, resource rationing, maintenance schedules that the mission requires. The system must be rigid enough to maintain civilizational discipline across centuries and flexible enough to adapt to conditions that the original designers could not have anticipated. No political theory has ever produced a design that reliably achieves both of those things simultaneously, even under the far more forgiving conditions of terrestrial governance. And governance is not merely a structural problem. It is a legitimacy problem. On Earth, governments derive their authority from some combination of tradition, consent, divine mandate, constitutional framework, or sheer coercive power. Each of these sources of legitimacy has a shelf life. Traditions erode. Consent must be continually renewed. Divine mandates are challenged by schism and doubt. Constitutional frameworks require interpretation that shifts with each generation of interpreters. Coercive power provokes resistance. On a generation ship, the founding generation may consent to the governance structure. They chose to board. They agreed to the rules. But what about the fifth generation? The 10th? By that point, the founding charter is an ancient document written by people no one alive has ever met, in a context no one alive has ever experienced. The rules it prescribes may no longer make sense to a population that has developed its own culture, its own values, its own understanding of what fairness and justice mean inside the only world they have ever known. The legitimacy of the original compact erodes with every generation that had no voice in creating it. This is not speculation. It is a direct extrapolation from observed human behavior across far shorter timescales and under far less extreme conditions. The Mars 500 experiment, conducted between 2010 and 2011 at the Institute of Biomedical Problems in Moscow, confined 6 men inside a 550 cubic meter facility for 520 days to simulate a round-trip mission to Mars. The crew was carefully selected, psychologically screened, and highly motivated. They knew the experiment had an end date. They knew they could, in a genuine emergency, leave. Despite all of that, 4 of the 6 crew members developed significant sleep disruptions. Activity levels declined over the course of the mission. 1 crew member showed signs consistent with chronic depression. The crew's behavioral data revealed what researchers called a stage-changing pattern of psychological adaptation, with periods of adequate functioning alternating with periods of withdrawal, reduced engagement, and interpersonal friction. The researchers observed substantial inter-individual differences in how crew members coped with the confinement and isolation. Some maintained relatively stable moods and routines. Others deteriorated significantly. Conflict between crew members increased over the mission's duration, and the crew's social dynamics showed cyclic patterns of organization, disorganization, and reorganization that researchers compared to patterns observed in Antarctic overwinter expeditions. Antarctic stations have provided some of the richest data on long-duration isolation. Researchers studying French and Italian crews at polar stations documented what is known as winter over syndrome, a pattern of psychological symptoms including irritability, insomnia, cognitive impairment, depression, hostility, and social withdrawal that emerges predictably during the long Antarctic winter when outdoor activity is impossible and the crew is confined to the station interior. Studies at the Concordia station, one of the most isolated human habitations on Earth, found periodic changes in social grouping and non-verbal behavior that reflected ongoing, dynamic adaptation to confinement. The adaptations were not stable, they cycled. The group would organize, fracture, reorganize, fracture again, in patterns that repeated but did not converge on a steady state. Submarine crews offer another window. Nuclear submarines routinely deploy for 60 to 90 days submerged, with crews of over 100 living in confined quarters with no natural light, no fresh air, and no communication with family. The psychological literature on submarine service documents elevated rates of anxiety, depression, and interpersonal conflict during extended patrols. Submarine crews are military personnel, selected for psychological resilience, trained extensively in stress management, and operating within a rigid hierarchical structure designed specifically to maintain discipline under confinement. Despite all of that, the psychological toll is real and measurable. Every one of these analogues, Mars 500, Antarctic stations, submarine patrols, shares a critical feature that a generation ship does not. They end. The crew knows, with absolute certainty, that on a specific date, the hatch will open, the helicopter will arrive, the submarine will surface. That knowledge is not a minor psychological detail. It is the single most important factor sustaining mental health during confinement. Researchers consistently identify the endpoint as the anchor that allows confined individuals to tolerate conditions they would otherwise find unbearable. The psychological literature calls it the prospect of relief. Remove it, and the coping strategies that sustain people through temporary confinement collapse. On a generation ship, there is no prospect of relief. Not for the founding crew, who will die aboard the vessel. Not for the second generation, who were born aboard and will die aboard. Not for the 10th generation, whose endpoint is still a century or more in the future. For the intermediate generations, the ones born after departure and dying before arrival, the mission has no personal endpoint at all. They are living, from birth to death, inside a vessel that is going somewhere they will never reach, for a purpose that was defined before they were born, maintained by systems they did not design and cannot escape. The psychological literature has no direct analogue for this condition. It has analogues for confinement. It has analogues for isolation. It has analogues for monotony, for resource constraint, for interpersonal friction in small groups. But it has no analogue for a population of people who are born into permanent captivity, with no prospect of release, no external reference point, and no lived experience of the world their mission is supposed to reach. That absence of analogy is itself a data point. It means we are proposing to subject human beings to conditions whose psychological effects we cannot predict because nothing comparable has ever been tested or observed. There is a dimension of the psychological challenge that extends beyond confinement and isolation, beyond the absence of an endpoint, into the biology of the brain itself. It is the problem of sensory deprivation across an entire lifetime. Human brains evolved in an environment of extraordinary sensory richness. Wind across skin, sunlight shifting through a canopy, the sound of running water, birdsong, thunder, rain on leaves, the smell of wet earth after a storm, temperature variations between morning and evening, between shade and open ground, between summer and winter. The constant, unpredictable flux of a natural environment provided the sensory inputs that shaped the development of the human nervous system over hundreds of thousands of years. A generation ship provides almost none of this. The lighting is artificial, likely limited to a narrow spectrum optimized for energy efficiency and plant growth, rather than for the full spectrum complexity of sunlight. The temperature is regulated to a narrow band. The sounds are mechanical, the hum of ventilation, the rhythm of pumps, the steady drone of a vessel that never stops operating. There is no wind, there is no weather, there is no variation in the sky because there is no sky. The corridors look the same today as they did yesterday, as they will tomorrow, as they will in 50 years. Neuroscience research on environmental enrichment has demonstrated, across multiple species, including humans, that sensory complexity during development has measurable effects on brain structure and cognitive function. Animals raised in enriched environments with varied stimuli develop thicker cerebral cortices, more synaptic connections, and better performance on learning and memory tasks than animals raised in barren enclosures. In humans, children raised in institutional environments with minimal sensory stimulation show reduced cortical thickness, impaired executive function, and elevated rates of attention disorders and emotional dysregulation. The effects are not entirely reversible, even with later enrichment. A generation ship is, in neuroscientific terms, a barren enclosure. Not by intention, but by necessity. The environmental variation that the human brain expects, that it was built to process and requires for healthy development, cannot be replicated inside a metal cylinder. Artificial environments can provide some stimulation. Parks, gardens, variable lighting schedules, recorded natural sounds, but these are approximations. They lack the unpredictability, the scale, and the multi-sensory integration of a natural environment. A recorded bird call is not a bird. A projected sky is not a sky. The brain, particularly the developing brain of a child, can distinguish between a simulation and the real thing, even when the conscious mind cannot articulate the difference. Over generations, the cognitive consequences of sensory monotony would accumulate, not as a dramatic decline, but as a slow narrowing of the baseline. Each generation grows up in the same impoverished sensory environment and calibrates its expectations accordingly. The children of the ship have no memory of sensory richness. They do not know what they are missing. Their brains develop to match the inputs available, and those inputs are limited by the walls of the vessel. The population does not become less intelligent. It becomes differently developed, optimized for an environment that rewards routine recognition and procedural consistency rather than the adaptive flexibility that a varied natural environment demands. This matters because adaptive flexibility is exactly what a generation ship crisis would require. When a system fails unexpectedly, when a novel problem emerges that the maintenance manual does not address, The people who must solve it need cognitive flexibility, creative problem-solving, and the ability to integrate information across unfamiliar domains. These are precisely the capacities that sensory-rich environments develop and sensory-poor environments do not. The ship creates a population adapted to normalcy, and then depends on that population to respond effectively to abnormality. And the psychological environment inside the ship would be shaped by another force that operates on timescales too long for any individual to perceive, but too powerful for any institution to resist. Drift. Not the physical drift of the vessel through space, but the cultural, linguistic, and ideological drift of the society within it. In 2020, a study published in Acta Futura, the journal of the European Space Agency's Advanced Concepts team, examined how language would evolve aboard an interstellar vessel over a multi-generational journey. The authors, linguistics professors Andrew Mackenzie and Jeffrey Punsky, drew on well-established principles of historical linguistics to reach a conclusion that should unsettle anyone planning a centuries-long mission. Language change, they argued, is not a risk that might occur aboard a generation ship. It is a certainty. Languages evolve whenever communities become isolated from one another. New vocabulary emerges to describe new experiences. Pronunciation shifts incrementally with each generation. Grammatical structures simplify, complexify, or reorganize in response to the communicative needs of the community. Words that describe things the community no longer encounters: snow, ocean, mountain, wind, horse, forest, gradually lose meaning and drop out of use. Words that describe the ship's unique environment and social structures are invented and become central. Mackenzie estimated that after 10 generations of isolation, roughly 250 to 300 years, the language aboard the ship would have diverged so far from its origin that communication with Earth would become immensely difficult, perhaps pointless. The language of the ship would, in effect, become a new language, not a dialect, not an accent. A language as different from its ancestor as modern English is from Old English, which is to say, mutually unintelligible without specialized training. This is not merely a communication problem. Language shapes thought. The concepts a language can express define the boundaries of what its speakers can reason about efficiently. A society whose language has drifted away from the technical vocabulary of its founding generation may struggle to maintain the precise engineering knowledge required to operate the ship's systems. A maintenance manual written in the founding language becomes progressively less comprehensible across generations. Technical terms lose their precision. Procedures that were clearly documented become ambiguous when read through the lens of a language that has shifted the meaning of critical words. The study's authors recommended that any interstellar crew include trained linguists and implement a deliberate meta-linguistic policy to slow language change. But slowing is not stopping. Language change is a fundamental property of human communication in isolated communities. It cannot be prevented. It can only be managed, and the management itself requires institutional resources and sustained effort across every generation of the mission. Language drift is the most easily modeled form of a broader phenomenon. Cultural drift operates by the same mechanisms but is even harder to control. The values, beliefs, social norms, aesthetic preferences, religious convictions, and shared stories of the founding population will transform across generations in ways that no one can predict. On Earth, cultural change is driven by contact with other cultures, by environmental pressures, by technological innovation, by generational rebellion, and by the simple accumulation of reinterpretation over time. On a generation ship, cultural change would be driven by all of these factors except external contact. The society evolves in isolation, referencing only itself, interpreting its founding documents through its own shifting lens, gradually constructing a worldview that may bear little resemblance to the one that motivated the mission in the first place. Historians and anthropologists call this process ethnogenesis when it occurs in isolated human populations. Over centuries, an isolated group develops its own distinct identity, its own myths of origin, its own social hierarchies, its own taboos and rituals. The people aboard a generation ship after 10 or 15 generations would not think of themselves as the descendants of Earth colonists, any more than modern Greeks think of themselves as ancient Athenians. They would be the people of the ship. Their identity would be defined by the ship. Their history would begin with the ship. The original mission, the original culture, the original purpose would survive only as a founding mythology, reinterpreted and reshaped by each successive generation to fit its own needs and circumstances. This is mission drift in its deepest form. Not the slow degradation of engineering systems, but the slow transformation of the reason for the mission's existence. The founders launched toward a specific star because they believed colonizing another world was worth the sacrifice. 5 generations later, the population may not share that belief. They may not understand it. They may have reinterpreted it into something unrecognizable. They may have developed a theology that views the ship as a sacred space and the destination as a myth. They may have concluded that the mission is a punishment inherited from sinful ancestors. They may simply not care about a planet they have never seen, orbiting a star that is still generations away, described in a language they no longer fully understand. And here is what makes mission drift existentially dangerous, rather than merely philosophically interesting. The ship still requires active maintenance. The life support systems still require skilled operators. The reactors still require engineers. The agricultural systems still require careful management. If the society aboard the ship drifts far enough from the technical culture required to maintain these systems, the ship dies. Not because anything broke, because the people inside stopped understanding or valuing the knowledge required to keep it working. There is one more social structure that would almost certainly emerge aboard a generation ship, and that most proposals either ignore or mention only in passing: class stratification. On Earth, every complex society in recorded history has developed hierarchies based on access to critical resources, specialized knowledge, or political power. These hierarchies tend to calcify over time, with advantages and disadvantages concentrating in family lines across generations. Social mobility exists in some societies more than others, but even the most egalitarian arrangements produce measurable stratification within a few generations. A generation ship would produce stratification faster and more rigidly than virtually any terrestrial society, for a simple structural reason. The ship's survival depends on a small number of critical technical roles, and the people who fill those roles hold power over everyone else, whether they intend to or not. The fusion engineers who maintain the reactors control the energy supply. Without them, the lights go out, the air stops cycling, the food stops growing, and everyone dies. The atmospheric technicians who manage the gas exchange systems control the air. The water recycling specialists control the water. The agricultural managers control the food supply. These individuals do not need to seek power. Power is inherent in their function. They are essential. Everyone else is, to varying degrees, dependent on them. Over time, this functional hierarchy would almost certainly become a social hierarchy. The families that produce engineers and atmospheric technicians, generation after generation, would accumulate status, influence, and access to resources. They would naturally begin to view their role as not merely occupational but hereditary, a birthright tied to the survival of the community. They would advocate, consciously or unconsciously, for policies that protect their position. Access to technical training would become a gatekeeping mechanism. The children of the technical elite would receive preferential access to the education required to fill critical roles, while the children of non-technical families would be channeled toward lower status functions. This is not cynicism, It is a pattern that has repeated in every isolated, resource-constrained human society where specific families or groups controlled access to essential resources. Medieval European society organized itself around land ownership and military capability. Polynesian chiefdom societies organized around genealogical rank and control of land and marine resources. In both cases, functional advantage became hereditary privilege within a few generations. On a generation ship, the stratification would interact with the reproductive management system in particularly dangerous ways. If the genetic planning authority is drawn from the technical elite, which is likely because they hold the most social power, they gain influence over who reproduces with whom. This creates the possibility that genetic and political power concentrate in the same families, producing a hereditary ruling class whose authority is reinforced by both technical indispensability and control over the population's reproductive future. The founding generation might design safeguards against this. Term limits, randomized educational assignment, constitutional prohibitions on hereditary privilege. But safeguards are only as durable as the institutions that enforce them. And institutions drift. They are reinterpreted. They are hollowed out. They are captured by the groups that benefit most from their erosion. On Earth, constitutional protections have been circumvented, ignored, or formally amended by those in power within decades of their adoption. On a generation ship, with no external oversight, no free press, no independent judiciary drawing authority from a broader society, the safeguards would face even less resistance to erosion. The result, after several generations, could be a society that resembles not the egalitarian spacefaring civilization imagined by the founders, but a caste system. A small technical aristocracy controlling the ship's essential systems and reproductive planning. A larger class of laborers performing agricultural, custodial, and manufacturing work. And, at the margins, those who cannot or will not conform to the system's requirements, managed by whatever justice mechanisms the ship has developed, which are themselves constrained by the impossibility of exile and the cost of imprisonment. This is the society that the generation ship produces, not by design but by gravity. The social gravity of resource control, knowledge monopoly, and hereditary advantage, operating without the countervailing forces that terrestrial societies rely on to resist stratification, immigration, revolution, external competition, and the simple existence of somewhere else to go. Sarah Thomason, a linguist who studied language change in the context of multi-generational space travel, pointed out that the vocabulary loss would not be limited to poetic or environmental terms. Technical vocabulary is equally vulnerable. Words like subduction, stoichiometry, neutron flux, or biofilm, terms that describe processes critical to the ship's operation, carry meaning only within a framework of scientific understanding. If that framework erodes through cultural drift, the words become empty sounds. The manual still exists. The words are still printed on the page. But the person reading them no longer possesses the conceptual architecture required to understand what they mean. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is a failure of cultural transmission. And it is the expected outcome, not the unlikely one, when a small population is isolated for periods longer than any cultural tradition has ever survived intact on Earth. Consider how many intellectual traditions have been lost in human history, even with large populations and extensive contact networks. The Roman formula for concrete was lost for roughly 1,000 years after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Greek fire, the incendiary weapon of the Byzantine navy, was lost permanently when the empire fell. Entire writing systems have been invented, used for centuries, and then forgotten so completely that modern scholars spent decades deciphering them. These losses occurred in civilizations numbering in the millions, with extensive trade networks, written records, and institutional continuity. A generation ship has none of those buffers. The Chrysalis design team recognized the severity of this problem. Their proposal included artificial intelligence agents that would share information, experiences, and decision-making processes with the human population. The idea was that AI could serve as a stabilizing force, preserving technical knowledge and institutional memory across generations, even as the human culture transformed around it. This is a thoughtful response, but it introduces its own hazards. A society that depends on AI for institutional memory may lose the capacity to function without it. If the AI system degrades, malfunctions, or is deliberately corrupted by a faction within the ship's politics, the dependency becomes a catastrophic vulnerability, and a society governed partly by an artificial intelligence that was designed by the founding generation faces the same legitimacy crisis as one governed by a founding constitution. The AI embodies the values and priorities of people who are long dead. The living population may not share those values. The tension between inherited authority and present needs does not disappear because the authority is encoded in software rather than written on paper. Every dimension of the social challenge, genetics, governance, psychology, language, culture, points in the same direction. A generation ship does not merely transport a population through space. It demands that a population remain coherent, competent, and committed across a time span that exceeds the demonstrated capacity of any human social system to maintain stability. It demands this under conditions of confinement, isolation, and resource constraint that have produced measurable psychological damage in every short-duration experiment ever conducted. And it demands this from people who did not volunteer for it, who cannot leave, and who may no longer understand or value the purpose that set the ship in motion. The engineering is hard, the biology is harder. But the social reality is the dimension where the generation ship concept moves from daunting to genuinely disturbing. Because engineers can build redundancy into reactors, and biologists can model genetic drift in isolated populations, but no one has ever designed a society that is guaranteed to remain functional under these conditions. No one has even produced a theoretical framework that suggests it is reliably possible. And beneath the social challenge, beneath the governance and the genetics and the psychology and the drift, there is one more layer, the deepest one, the one that most discussions of generation ships avoid entirely because it has no engineering solution and no policy remedy. It is the question of what it means to be born inside a decision you did not make, bound to a purpose you did not choose, inside a world you cannot leave, heading toward a destination you may never reach. It is the question of inherited obligation, and it is the question that transforms the generation ship from an engineering proposal into a moral problem unlike anything humanity has ever faced. There is a thought experiment that philosophers have debated for centuries, long before anyone imagined a spacecraft carrying families between the stars. It asks a simple question: can a contract bind someone who never signed it? The question appears in different forms across the history of political philosophy. John Locke argued that legitimate government requires the consent of the governed. Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote about the social contract, the implicit agreement by which individuals surrender certain freedoms in exchange for the protections of collective society. Every democratic tradition on Earth rests, at some level, on the principle that political authority derives from the agreement of the people subject to it. Even in systems where explicit consent is not sought, there is an assumption that citizens could, in theory, leave. They could emigrate. They could renounce their citizenship. They could, at the extreme, revolt. The existence of an exit, even a difficult or dangerous one, provides a foundation for the claim that participation in the social order is, at some meaningful level, voluntary. A generation ship eliminates the exit, completely, irrevocably. For everyone born after departure, the founding crew consented. They understood the terms. They evaluated the sacrifice, weighed it against whatever combination of idealism, ambition, desperation, or curiosity moved them, and they walked through the airlock. Their consent was real. It was informed. It was voluntary. Whatever suffering the mission imposed on them, they chose it with open eyes. Their children did not. This is the moral fracture at the center of the generation ship concept, and it is not a problem that better engineering can repair. The first generation born aboard the vessel enters existence inside a sealed world they had no part in selecting, committed to a mission they had no voice in approving, bound by rules they did not negotiate, sustained by systems they are obligated to maintain, heading toward a destination they have never seen, and separated from the world their parents left behind by a distance so vast that return is physically impossible. They did not consent to any of it. They were born into it. And the only alternative to participation is death, because the ship is the only environment capable of sustaining their lives. Every generation after the first deepens this condition. By the third generation, no one aboard has ever met a person who chose to be there. By the fifth, the founding crew exists only as names in a historical record, figures in a story, faces in photographs that depict a world the living population has never experienced. By the 10th generation, the founding decision is as remote and abstract as the Norman conquest is to a modern English citizen. It shaped everything about the world they inhabit, but it carries no emotional weight, no felt connection, no sense of personal relevance. It is history. And history, as every civilization on Earth has demonstrated, is reinterpreted, simplified, mythologized, and eventually forgotten by the people who inherit its consequences. Yet the consequences persist. The ship still moves. The destination is still ahead. The systems still require maintenance. The population still must eat, breathe, reproduce, and cooperate. The obligations imposed by the founding decision do not expire when the memory of that decision fades. They are structural. They are permanent. They are written into the physics of the vessel and the vacuum surrounding it. No vote can repeal them. No revolution can escape them. No philosophy can dissolve them. The ship must be maintained, or everyone dies. The food must be grown, or everyone starves. The air must be recycled, or everyone suffocates. These are not political obligations enforced by a government that could be reformed or overthrown. They are physical constraints enforced by the laws of thermodynamics and the absence of an atmosphere outside the hull. This creates a moral condition without precedent in human experience. On Earth, even the most constrained and oppressive social arrangements exist within a larger environment that offers at least the theoretical possibility of escape. A prisoner can dream of release. A citizen of an authoritarian state can imagine crossing the border. A member of a rigid social hierarchy can conceive of a different system, even if they cannot achieve it in their own lifetime. The existence of an outside, a world beyond the walls, provides a reference point against which the justice or injustice of one's condition can be measured. A generation ship has no outside. There is no alternative society to compare to. There is no border to cross. There is no natural environment to flee into. There is no Earth to return to, not because the voyage is long, but because by the time the intermediate generations are alive, the Earth they would return to is separated from them by distances that no available technology can bridge within their lifetimes. The ship is not a temporary arrangement. It is the entirety of reality for everyone born inside it. The walls are not barriers to freedom. They are the boundaries of existence itself. Philosophers have a term for a condition in which an individual's entire life is shaped by circumstances they did not choose and cannot alter. They call it thrownness. The concept was developed by Martin Heidegger to describe the fundamental human condition of being born into a world, a language, a body, a historical moment, without having chosen any of them. Every human being experiences thrownness to some degree. None of us chose our parents, our country, our era, or the physical laws that govern our universe. But terrestrial thrownness is softened by openness. The world into which we are thrown is vast, varied, and full of possibilities that we did not anticipate. A person born into poverty may, through effort or luck, transform their circumstances. The range of possible lives available to a human being on Earth is enormous, constrained by material conditions but not bounded by walls. On a generation ship, thrownness is total. The world into which you are thrown is a machine. Its dimensions are fixed. Its resources are finite. Its population is predetermined. Your range of possible lives is defined by the ship's carrying capacity, the roles that need to be filled, and the reproductive schedule that the population's genetic health requires. You will not discover a new continent. You will not encounter a foreign culture. You will not change careers on a whim because the ship needs a specific number of engineers, farmers, doctors, and technicians, and those needs do not flex to accommodate individual aspiration. The corridor you walk to breakfast is the same corridor your grandchildren will walk to theirs. There is no word in any existing moral vocabulary for what it means to impose this condition on a person who has not consented to it. Slavery is the closest analog in terms of structural constraint, but even slavery, in its most brutal historical forms, existed within a larger world that the enslaved person could imagine being free in. The generation ship does not enslave its inhabitants in any conventional sense. No one is owned, no one is bought or sold, but everyone is bound to the ship, bound to the mission, bound to the maintenance schedule and the reproductive plan, and the resource allocation system, and the social hierarchy that emerged from the founding charter or evolved in the centuries since, bound not by chains, but by vacuum. By the absolute, non-negotiable fact that outside the hull there is nothing that can sustain a human life. And here is the dimension of this problem that most discussions of generation ships do not reach. The people born aboard the ship are not merely constrained. They are instrumentalized. Their lives serve a purpose that was defined before they existed. They are, in the most literal sense, means to an end. The end is arrival at the destination. Their role is to maintain the ship, maintain the population, and produce the generation that will either arrive or produce the generation after that. Their individual lives have value within the system only insofar as they contribute to the mission's continuation. A person who cannot or will not contribute, who is disabled, who is mentally ill, who refuses to work, who rejects the mission's purpose, becomes a burden on a system with no surplus capacity for burdens. On Earth, societies have developed elaborate moral and legal frameworks to protect the dignity of individuals who cannot contribute economically or socially. Disability rights, social safety nets, religious and philosophical traditions that affirm the inherent worth of every person regardless of their utility. These frameworks exist because the societies that developed them had enough surplus resources to support them and enough moral imagination to demand them. A generation ship operates at the edge of its carrying capacity by design. Every calorie is accounted for. Every liter of water is recycled. Every hour of labor is allocated against a maintenance schedule that cannot slip. The surplus that makes compassion affordable on Earth may not exist aboard the ship. The moral frameworks that protect the vulnerable may erode under the pressure of a system that cannot afford passengers in any sense of the word. And the people who make those decisions, the people who allocate resources and determine who contributes and who does not, are themselves products of the ship's culture, shaped by its constraints, operating without external moral reference points, and accountable to no authority beyond the ship's own governance structure. This is how a generation ship transforms the meaning of civilization itself. On Earth, civilization is an open system. It grows, it changes, it absorbs new ideas, it expands into new territories. It makes mistakes and sometimes recovers from them. It is, for all its flaws and failures, a project that each generation can reshape, redirect, and reimagine. The future is not predetermined. The direction is not fixed. The purpose is continually renegotiated by the living. On a generation ship, civilization becomes a closed system. It does not grow, it maintains. It does not explore, it endures. The direction is fixed, the purpose was determined at departure. And the living do not renegotiate it. They inherit it, they serve it, they pass it on. The relationship between the individual and the collective shifts from participation to obligation. The collective does not exist to serve the individual's flourishing. The individual exists to serve the collective's survival. Some might argue that this is true of all societies to some degree, that every civilization requires its members to subordinate personal desires to collective needs, that taxes, laws, military service, and social obligations all represent constraints on individual freedom imposed by the group. This is correct, but the difference is not one of degree, it is one of kind. On Earth, the constraint is partial. You sacrifice some freedom in exchange for the benefits of collective life. On a generation ship, the constraint is total. You sacrifice every form of freedom that depends on the existence of an outside, freedom of movement, freedom of association with people beyond the ship, freedom to leave, freedom to opt out, freedom to live by different rules in a different place, in exchange for the single benefit of not dying in the vacuum of space. And the people making that exchange did not agree to it. Their ancestors agreed to it for them. There is a term in ethics for the imposition of conditions on future people by present decisions. It is called intergenerational ethics. The field grapples with questions like climate change, nuclear waste storage, and national debt, situations where the choices of one generation create consequences for those that follow. In most cases, the future generation inherits both the burden and the broader world in which to manage it. They may struggle with rising sea levels, but they will struggle on a planet with 7 continents and a breathable atmosphere. They inherit options. They inherit maneuverability. They inherit the capacity, however constrained, to adapt. The descendants aboard a generation ship inherit none of those things. They inherit a hull. They inherit a recycling system. They inherit a population with shrinking genetic diversity and a culture drifting away from the knowledge base required to operate the machine they live inside. They inherit a mission that may no longer make sense to them, heading toward a planet they have no relationship with, in service of a species they have never encountered. And they inherit the absolute, unalterable fact that they cannot choose differently. The decision was made. The ship is in transit. The void is outside. There is nowhere else to go. Consider what arrival might look like, if it ever comes. After 10 generations, 15, 20, the ship reaches its destination star. There is a planet. Perhaps it is habitable. Perhaps it requires decades of terraforming. Perhaps the initial surveys, conducted by the founding generation's instruments from 4 light-years away, were wrong. Perhaps the atmosphere is not breathable. Perhaps the gravity is wrong. Perhaps the radiation environment is hostile. Perhaps the planet is nothing like what was promised. But set aside those possibilities. Assume the best case. The planet is viable. The ship arrives. The doors open. Or rather, the doors could open. Now, the population faces a choice that is psychologically almost incomprehensible. These people have never lived outside. They have never seen an open sky, except in images. They have never breathed air that was not recycled through a machine. They have never walked on ground that was not a deck plate. They have never experienced weather, unfiltered sunlight, wind, rain, the smell of soil that was not contained inside a grow module. The world outside the ship is, to them, an alien environment. The ship is home. The ship is everything they have ever known. The assumption that arrival is a triumph requires a further assumption that the arriving generation will want to leave the ship. That assumption is not safe. After centuries of enclosed existence, The population may view the exterior environment with fear, confusion, or hostility. They may lack the physical conditioning to tolerate planetary gravity if it differs from the ship's artificial gravity. They may lack the psychological conditioning to tolerate open spaces after a lifetime inside corridors. Agoraphobia, the fear of open or unenclosed spaces, is a documented clinical condition that develops even in people who grew up on Earth. What develops in people who have never experienced an open space at all is an entirely unknown question. And even if the arriving generation is willing and able to leave the ship, they face a task almost as daunting as the journey itself. They must build a civilization on an alien world, using whatever knowledge, skills, and materials they brought with them. Knowledge that has been filtered through centuries of cultural drift and may no longer accurately represent the science and engineering it was originally derived from. They must learn to interact with a biosphere they have never encountered, eat food they have never tasted, manage an atmosphere they did not grow up in, and navigate a gravity field that may feel wrong in their bones. And they must do all of this while carrying the psychological weight of being the generation that was supposed to justify everything. Every life lived and lost aboard the ship, every sacrifice, every constrained choice, every child born into obligation, every person who died in a metal corridor without seeing a star through anything but a monitor was justified by this moment. The arrival generation carries the accumulated moral debt of the entire voyage. If they fail to establish a viable colony, if the planet proves hostile, if the population collapses in its first century on the surface, then every generation that lived and died aboard the ship lived and died for nothing, not for a noble cause that fell short, for nothing. Because the purpose of their existence was arrival, and arrival failed. This is the weight that no engineering specification can quantify, the weight of inherited purpose imposed across centuries on people who did not choose it, culminating in a moment that may or may not redeem the sacrifice, borne by individuals who are the products of a culture so transformed by isolation that they may not even understand the concept of redemption in the terms the founders intended. And here, at last, is the deepest terror of the generation ship, not the mechanical failures, not the resource depletion, not the genetic bottleneck, or the governance crisis, or the psychological collapse. Those are all real, and any one of them could end the mission. But beneath them all, beneath the engineering and the biology and the sociology, there is something worse. The generation ship asks whether human survival, human civilization, and human exploration are the same thing. We have always assumed they are. We explore because we are alive. We build civilizations because we are curious, ambitious, restless. The urge to see what lies beyond the horizon is, we tell ourselves, inseparable from the urge to live. The generation ship tests that assumption by separating them entirely. Survival aboard the ship requires the suppression of exploration. There is nowhere to explore. Civilization aboard the ship requires the suppression of freedom. There is no room for unmanaged choice. And the exploration that the mission was designed to achieve, reaching a new world, requires the suppression of every instinct. The intermediate generations might have to live for themselves, rather than for a destination they will never see. The generation ship does not merely ask whether humans can travel far enough. It asks whether a miniature civilization can remain stable, purposeful, and alive for so long that the ship itself becomes a prison of inherited obligation. It asks whether the people inside can sustain meaning across centuries of enclosure, isolation, and drift. It asks whether a society can function without an outside, without an exit, without the possibility of change that is not merely rearranging the furniture inside the same sealed room. And the most honest answer available, drawn from every experiment, every historical parallel, every simulation, and every serious study that has attempted to address these questions, is that we do not know. We do not know because nothing like this has ever been attempted. We do not know because the conditions are unprecedented. We do not know because the variables are too numerous, the timescales too long, and the human factors too unpredictable to model with confidence. What we do know is this: every closed system experiment has failed or been terminated early. Every long-duration isolation study has produced psychological damage in willing, trained volunteers who knew the end was coming. Every small, isolated human population in recorded history has experienced significant cultural and technological drift within centuries. Every political system has transformed or collapsed within a timespan shorter than the journey most generation ship concepts propose. Every moral framework that protects individual dignity has required surplus resources and external reference points that a generation ship may not be able to provide. We know that the engineering is theoretically possible, with enough resources and enough time to develop the required technologies. We know that the biology is theoretically manageable, with enough population size and enough reproductive oversight. We know that the systems can be designed with enough redundancy to tolerate individual failures. But we also know that the history of complex systems, both mechanical and social, is a history of failures that were not anticipated, interactions that were not modeled, and consequences that were not imagined by the people who built the system and declared it sound. The generation ship is humanity's most honest confrontation with the scale of the universe. It says plainly that the distances between the stars are so vast that no single human life can bridge them. It says that if we want to cross, we must commit not just ourselves, but our children, our grandchildren, and their grandchildren's grandchildren, to a journey that will define and constrain their entire existence. It says that the cost of reaching another star is not measured in fuel or money or engineering hours. It is measured in human lives lived inside a machine, in freedoms surrendered before birth, in purposes inherited without consent, and in the slow transformation of a crew into a culture, into a civilization, into something that may no longer resemble the species that launched the ship. The romantic image of the generation ship, the green hills curving upward inside a rotating cylinder, the children playing beneath an artificial sun, the noble multi-generational project of carrying humanity to the stars, is not a lie. It is a wish. A wish that the universe was small enough to cross without losing ourselves in the crossing. A wish that distance could be solved without transforming what it means to be human. A wish that the ark could carry us to the other shore without the voyage itself becoming the flood. The terrifying reality of the generation ship is not that it might fail. It is that even if it succeeds, even if every system holds and every generation cooperates and the destination is reached and the doors open onto a new world, the people who walk through those doors will not be the people who were promised. They will be something else, something shaped by centuries of enclosure, obligation, and drift. Something that emerged from the ship, the way a creature emerges from a cocoon, transformed beyond recognition, carrying the genes of its ancestors, but not their world, not their language, not their dreams. The generation ship does not solve the problem of interstellar distance. It translates that problem from physics into human terms. And in human terms, the distance between the stars is not measured in light years. It is measured in the number of lives required to bridge the gap, in the number of people who must be born, live, and die inside a purpose they never chose, in the number of generations that must hold together under conditions that have broken every comparable human arrangement in recorded history. That is the true cost of crossing. Not fuel, not time, not money. People, entire lifetimes, spent inside a sealed corridor, serving a mission that belongs to the dead. The universe is vast, and the price of crossing it may be one that no civilization can afford to pay without ceasing to be the civilization that wanted to cross in the first place. That is the terrifying reality of generation ships. And it is worse than you think, because the horror is not in the danger of the void outside, it is in what the voyage does to the world within.